In the last class, we've learned about equivalence scales, how to define and measure inequality and poverty, and how to define and measure the excess burden of taxation. In today's class, we will learn how the tax burden is shared by the different parties to a transaction, and how progressivity is defined and achieved. In many countries, social security taxes are imposed in a way that reflects the legislator's intention that the tax, which is in essence an insurance premium paid for the benefit of the employees, be shared by employees and employers. The law specifically orders that employers pay some, usually half, of the tax. In the US, for example, a payroll tax, which includes Social Security and Medicare, equal to 7.65% of the worker's earnings, must be paid by employers in addition to a tax at the same rate, that is 7.65%, paid by the workers themselves. However, the economic incidence of the tax, which means who actually bears the economic burden of the tax, is unaffected by the legal incidence of the tax, which means who is legally obligated to pay the tax. Research found that employees probably bear most of the Social Security tax alone. That is, they bear most or even all of the tax that is legally imposed on their employer. It happens because the market forces allow employers to shift the economic burden of the tax which the law imposes on them, to their employees by lowering their wages. There are numerous other examples of cases in which the legal incidence was found to be meaningless, since the economic tax burden was shifted from the legally taxed taxpayer to someone else. The law cannot determine who will bear the tax burden. Only the market forces can, because of the tax burden can be shifted to others through changes in price. Let's examine it by looking at the following two graphs. The first graph is the one we used in our previous class when we studied the topic of excess burden. As I hope you all remember, before tax, the equilibrium price was $10 a shirt. Then, a $5 unit tax was imposed on the producers, and the outcome was that the tax shifted up the supply curve by the amount of the tax. Let me emphasize the point we are studying now. The graph illustrates the case in which the law imposes a tax on the producers. Taxes are often stated as percentage of the price of the unit sold. We're assuming that the tax is a unit tax, which is a tax levied at a fixed dollar amount per unit of a commodity sold. We do so for simplicity of exposition, because as I said in the previous class, this does not change our analysis. Going back to our example, a $5 unit tax was imposed. Why did the supply curve shift up? It happened because after the imposition of the tax, the cost of production of each unit does not change. The producers still need to receive the same amount of money for each marginal unit as they did before the tax was imposed. For example, producing the 80th unit costs the producers $8 to produce. This cost of production does not change due to the imposition of tax. Hence, the producer will produce the 80th unit only if he were paid the full cost plus the tax. For this to happen, the consumers need to pay $13. It costs the producers $10 to produce the 100th unit. This cost of production does not change due to the imposition of the tax. Hence, the producer will produce the 100th unit only if he were paid the full cost plus the tax. For this to happen, the consumers need to pay $15. To find the supply curve, as is perceived by consumers, namely the price after tax, the entire supply curve has to be shifted up by the amount of the tax. A new equilibrium was formed at the price of $13 per shirt. This is the point of intersection with the demand curve. It did not happen at the 100th shirt because the consumers were unwilling to pay more than $10 for the 100th shirt. They are willing to pay $13 for the 80th shirt. Sale of 80 shirts at a price of $13 a piece is the new equilibrium. $13 was what the consumers paid for each and every shirt out of the total of 80 shirts they've purchased. The price received by the producers was $8 per shirt, since $5 the producers had to pay to the tax authorities. We see that the new consumer surplus in purple and the new producer surplus in green. The gray trapezoid illustrates the loss in consumer and producer surplus, and the brown, the tax collected. $400 were collected in tax. The tax resulted in excess burden of $50, reflecting the 20 sales of t-shirts that did not take place due to the tax. The area of the excess burden triangle is 20 times $5 divided by 2, because that's how you calculate the area of a triangle. $30 out of the excess burden was loss of consumer surplus, and $20 were loss of producer surplus. The second graph is new. The only difference between the two graphs is that in the second graph, the tax was imposed on the consumers and not on the producers as in the first graph. Before the imposition of the tax, the consumers were willing to pay $13 for the 80th shirt. But the number of shirts sold at equilibrium was 100. And for the 100th shirt, consumers were willing to pay only $10. The tax did not change the value that the consumers place on a shirt. They still are willing to pay only $13 for the 80th shirt. And this is the new equilibrium price, because after the imposition of the $5 tax, per unit tax, only 80 shirts are being sold. There is no reason to think that the tax affects the underlying valuation consumers place on the shirt. As a result of the tax, however, the producers will receive from the consumers only $8 on the sale of the 80th shirt, as $5 will be paid by the consumers to the tax authority. This means that the demand curve, as perceived by the suppliers, has shifted downwards by the size of the tax, which is $5 in our example. What is remarkable to see is that the two graphs lead to exactly the same outcome. The new equilibrium formed by the shift of the demand curve downwards due to the tax imposed on consumers is exactly the same equilibrium that was formed by the imposition of the tax on producers, which led to the shifting of the supply curve upwards. I'm kind of stating the obvious now, but we'll say it nevertheless. The equilibrium price is $13 per shirt. This is what the consumers paid. The price received by the producers was $8 per shirt. $400 were collected in tax. The tax resulted in excess burden of $50, out of which $30 were loss of consumer surplus and $20 were loss of producer surplus. The outcome is identical to the outcome in the case illustrated in the first graph, in which the tax was legally imposed on the producers. It does not matter at all on whom the law imposes the tax. the market forces will change the prices and reach the same outcome in both cases. The legislator often fails to internalize this insight. We already mentioned Social Security to be an example of this. There are numerous other examples of this phenomenon. In the next unit, we'll look at one more.